I remember the night I decided to lose everything. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a tragedy. It was a choice. I wanted to see what love really looked like when the money disappeared, when comfort vanished, and all that was left was me. I thought I knew my family. I truly did. I believed we were built on something stronger than wealth or appearances. But that night, as I stared at the empty house I once called home, I realized I was about to find out what truth really costs. I told myself it was only a test, just a small test of love and loyalty. But deep down, I knew that once I started, nothing would ever be the same again. Thank you for watching and spending this moment with me. It means more than you know. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from, so please take a second to comment below and tell me. My name is Mary, and I live in a quiet little town in Alaska, surrounded by mountains that hold the kind of silence only the cold can bring. Life here has always been simple but beautiful. I used to wake up to the sound of the wind brushing against my window, make my coffee, and stand by the kitchen counter, watching the sky slowly turn from gray to gold. My days were filled with routines that brought me comfort. Watering my small garden, checking on the mail, cooking dinner for my husband when he came home, and waiting for the occasional phone call from my children. We weren't a perfect family, but we had what I thought was love, or at least I wanted to believe we did. I spent most of my life taking care of everyone around me. I was the woman who kept things running, who remembered birthdays, who made sure no one ever went to bed hungry or alone. I built a home out of warmth, not walls, and I thought that kind of love would always come back when I needed it. But lately, I had begun to notice something that made my heart ache in ways I couldn't ignore. The calls had become fewer, the visits shorter, and even when they came, it felt like they were only half there. My husband had grown distant too, always buried in his phone, always finding excuses to be elsewhere. He used to look at me like I mattered, but those eyes had turned tired, maybe even cold. I could sense that something between us had shifted, but I didn't know if it was age, pride, or simply time doing what time always does, pulling people apart quietly. I tried to talk about it, but every conversation seemed to end in silence. I began to wonder if I had done something wrong, if I had become invisible in my own life. One evening, while setting the dinner table, I overheard my name being whispered in the next room. My husband was on the phone, his voice low but sharp. He said, "She doesn't understand money anymore. She's too trusting. It's time she stops making decisions." Those words hit harder than any storm that's ever swept through Alaska. I stood there, holding a spoon, feeling my heart beat in my throat. That was the moment something inside me cracked, and through that small crack a wild thought slipped in. What if I disappeared? Not die, not run away, but vanish from their comfort. What if I stripped away everything they valued and left only me, standing there, helpless and empty, to see what remained of their love? That thought wouldn't leave me. It followed me from room to room, into my sleep, into my prayers. It became louder every time someone dismissed my worries or brushed off my feelings. Until one morning, as the sun struggled to rise over the frozen trees, I decided I would do it. I would pretend I had lost everything: the house, the car, the job, everything that tied their respect to my worth. I needed to see if love could survive without those things. I didn't know then that this choice, born out of pain and curiosity, would unravel everything I thought I knew about the people I had built my life around. The morning I decided to begin, the world outside was quiet, covered in a thin layer of snow that made everything seem peaceful, almost innocent. Which is strange because my heart felt anything but. I sat at the small table by the window, a cup of coffee turning cold in my hands, and I kept asking myself if I was doing the right thing. I wasn't sure anymore what right even meant. I had spent years doing what everyone expected from me, making sacrifices that no one remembered, and still, somehow, I had become the one they pitied, the one they brushed aside when real conversations began. So that morning, I took out a small notebook, one I used to keep recipes in, and I started writing down what I needed to do. It was my way of preparing, not for a journey, but for a test. I wrote, "Sell the car," even though I had no intention of selling it. "Close the account," though I knew I would only move the money somewhere safe. I wanted the illusion to feel real enough that no one would doubt it. When I finished writing, I looked around the house and wondered what it would look like empty. What it would sound like without my footsteps, without the hum of the heater, or the smell of my cooking. I tried to imagine the silence that would come after I left, but I couldn't, because I was still trying to believe that at least one person would notice my absence. I called my son first, pretending to be calm, and told him I had bad news. I said I'd lost my job and that things were getting harder. There was a pause, a long one, and I thought maybe he was trying to process it. Maybe he'd say, "It's okay, Mom, we'll figure it out." But what came instead froze me. He sighed and said, "You've always been too soft, Mom. You should have planned better. I wasn't born to live on scraps." His words cut clean, sharp like glass, and before I could respond, he said he had to go and ended the call. I sat there with the phone pressed against my ear, listening to the emptiness on the other end, and for the first time I felt like a stranger in my own family. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just sat quietly, letting the truth sink in. Later that evening, I told my husband. We were sitting in the living room, the same place where we had once laughed about silly things, where we had shared tea on cold nights. I looked at him and said softly, "I lost everything. The house will be gone soon, and the savings too." He didn't even look surprised. He just stared at the fireplace for a long time before saying, "My daughter is ashamed of you. Don't ruin what's left of our name." I didn't recognize the man sitting across from me anymore. The warmth that once filled the space between us had turned into air thick with judgment and disappointment. I thought marriage meant having someone who would hold your hand when the world fell apart, not someone who'd let go the moment the lights dimmed. That night, I lay awake, watching the ceiling, listening to him breathe beside me like a stranger, and I realized that my test had already begun, whether I was ready or not. The next morning, I packed a small bag, just a few clothes and some old photographs, nothing that could tie me to comfort. I looked around one last time at the house I had built, every corner holding a story, every wall carrying a memory, and I whispered, "If they can't love me without this, then they never loved me at all." I walked out without looking back, and as the cold air bit at my cheeks, I told myself that I would find out who truly cared when I had nothing to give. I didn't know then that the people I believed would protect me would be the first to close their doors, and that a stranger with nothing would show me more love than my own blood ever did. The air that morning felt heavier than usual, the kind of cold that seeps through your coat and settles deep inside your bones, reminding you that comfort was something you used to know. I stood at the edge of the driveway, watching my breath form little clouds that disappeared before I could even finish a thought. The house behind me stood tall and proud, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a museum of everything I'd lost: trust, love, belonging. I walked slowly down the road with my small bag in hand, not knowing exactly where I was going, only that I couldn't stay. Every step away from that house felt like I was peeling off another layer of who I used to be. I told myself it was just part of the test, that I needed to go through it to see what truth looked like. But the truth was already showing itself, cold and unkind. By the time I reached town, the snow had turned to slush, and cars passed without anyone noticing the woman walking along the side of the road. I stopped near a small cafe and looked inside through the window. People were laughing, holding warm cups, tapping their phones. None of them looked up, none of them saw me. And for the first time in my life, I understood how invisible people become once the world decides they're no longer useful. I found a bench nearby, sat down, and tried to warm my hands, but the cold wasn't just outside anymore. It had settled inside me, heavy like regret. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but I stopped myself. If my family couldn't open their doors to me, then no stranger owed me anything either. I wandered for hours, moving without direction, until the sky began to darken. The streetlights flickered on one by one, painting the sidewalks in dull amber light. I found an empty spot under a bridge where the wind didn't bite as hard, and I laid my coat on the ground, telling myself it was only for one night. I didn't sleep much. The sound of distant cars, the drip of water from the concrete above, and the hollow echo of my own heartbeat kept me awake. I thought about my husband's voice, the coldness in it, The way he said my name like it was something to be ashamed of. I thought about my son. The pride in his tone when he said he wasn't born to live on scraps, and how those words kept repeating in my head like a cruel song. I had given everything for them, every comfort, every dream, every piece of my youth. And yet, when I asked for love, they offered me distance. As the night grew colder, I pulled my coat tighter around me and whispered to myself that this was what I wanted, that I had chosen this test. But deep down, I knew no one ever chooses to feel forgotten. My stomach ached, my body trembled, and for the first time in many years I prayed, not for money, not for a miracle, but simply for warmth. When the morning came, I saw the first rays of sunlight stretch across the concrete, soft and golden, touching everything it could reach. That's when I realized something, quiet but powerful. The people I had built my life around had turned their backs, yet the world kept turning. The sun still rose, and I was still here. That meant I still had a chance, not to be loved by them, but to find something greater than the love I had lost. I didn't know where I'd go next, but as I stood up and brushed the dust from my coat, I knew my story wasn't over. It was just beginning. That morning, as the sun began to rise, I walked aimlessly through the streets, my shoes damp from the snow that had melted overnight, my hands stiff from the cold. I didn't know where I was heading, only that moving felt better than standing still. The world around me seemed different now. The same streets I had driven through for years suddenly felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else, someone who still had a place in it. I passed people rushing to work, clutching their coffee cups, faces buried in scarves, and none of them looked at me. It was as if I had vanished into a space between existence and memory. For a moment I wondered how many people I had walked past in my life without noticing. How many stories I had ignored because I was too busy living comfortably. That thought stung, because now I was one of them. The unseen, the forgotten, the person people turned away from when their eyes accidentally met. As the day stretched on, hunger started to creep in. Not the kind that makes you angry, but the kind that humbles you. I could feel my body growing weaker, my steps slower, and my mind heavier. I passed by a small bakery, the smell of freshly baked bread drifting through the air like a cruel reminder of everything I no longer had. I stood outside for a long while, just breathing it in, letting the warmth of that scent comfort me for a brief moment before walking away. I didn't have money, and even if I did, I told myself this was part of the lesson. If I was going to test love and loyalty, I needed to understand what it meant to have nothing. By noon, I found myself near the edge of town, where the buildings turned to old warehouses and the noise of the city began to fade. That was where I saw him, a small boy sitting by a wall, holding a tin bowl close to a tiny flame. His clothes were torn, his hair messy, but his eyes were steady, calm in a way that made me stop. He looked up and smiled, and without a word he motioned for me to come closer. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should, but something about his quiet kindness made me walk over. He held out the bowl toward me and said softly, "It's bone soup. It's not much, but it's warm." I stared at him, at the steam rising from that little bowl, at the trembling of his thin hands as he offered it to me. I couldn't speak at first. I wanted to tell him no, that I couldn't take it, that he needed it more than I did, but the truth was, I was starving. Not just for food, but for compassion. So I took the bowl gently, my fingers brushing his, and whispered, "Thank you." I brought it to my lips, and the taste was simple, almost nothing, but it felt like a feast. That soup warmed more than my body. It melted something frozen inside my heart. He didn't ask who I was, didn't question why I was there, didn't look at me with pity. He just sat quietly beside me, sipping from what was left in the bowl, and for the first time in days I felt seen. Not as a burden, not as someone who had failed, but as a person. I looked at him and thought, this child who has nothing has given me more humanity than those who had everything. The world had stripped him of comfort, but it hadn't taken his kindness. I realized then that maybe the test I had created wasn't about my family at all. Maybe it was about me, about the kind of person I would become when everything was gone. As we sat there in silence, sharing that small bowl of soup, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I knew, deep inside, that this moment, this quiet act of kindness, would change everything that came after. When night came again, I couldn't bring myself to leave the spot where I'd met that boy. Something about his quiet strength, his small act of generosity, lingered with me long after the last drop of soup had cooled in that tin bowl. I sat there watching him as he folded his blanket neatly and tucked it beneath his head like it was the most precious thing he owned. The streetlight above us flickered every few minutes, and in those moments of darkness, I could hear the faint sound of his breathing, steady and calm, like someone who had made peace with the life he'd been handed. I wondered how someone so young could find peace in a world that had given him so little, while the people in my life, with all their comfort and wealth, carried hearts so empty. That thought stayed with me until dawn broke again, painting the sky with soft orange and gray. I had spent my life chasing the kind of success that others could see, but now, sitting beside that boy, I began to realize that maybe the truest kind of wealth isn't what we store in banks or houses, it's what we give away without expecting anything in return. When the sun rose, he woke up and smiled as if it were any ordinary morning, but to me, it felt like something sacred. He asked if I was leaving, and I told him yes, though part of me wanted to stay. Before I left, I reached into my pocket, out of habit, forgetting that I had hidden my wallet days ago. My fingers touched a small folded note I'd written to myself before I left home, one that simply said, "When the test ends, remember who you are." I looked at it for a long moment, then tore it gently in half. The woman who had written that note was gone. I didn't need a reminder anymore. I had already remembered. As I walked away, I felt lighter. Not because my problems were solved, but because the weight of disappointment had begun to fade. That boy, without saying much at all, had reminded me that kindness still existed in a world that sometimes forgets it. Every step I took after that felt different. I wasn't running from pain anymore. I was walking toward purpose, even if I didn't yet know what that purpose would become. When I reached the bus station, I bought a one-way ticket to a nearby town using the few dollars I'd kept hidden in my coat. As the bus moved through the snowy roads, I stared out the window and watched the world blur by, thinking about how easily people pass by stories they'll never know. Every face I saw on the street seemed like a reminder that everyone carries a secret battle, a private ache, something no one else can see. I had judged the world too quickly before, thinking my suffering was unique, but now I knew pain is universal. It just wears different clothes. By the time I arrived in the next town, I had made a decision. I was done pretending to be helpless. I had seen what real struggle looked like, what genuine humanity felt like, and I couldn't go back to who I was before. I found a small, quiet hotel at the edge of the main road, paid for a room, and sat on the bed staring at the ceiling for a long time. The heat from the radiator filled the room, but it wasn't the warmth that comforted me. It was the silence, the kind that doesn't judge or expect. I whispered a thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to life itself for teaching me through pain what comfort never could. That night, I promised myself something simple yet powerful. If I ever used my wealth again, it wouldn't be to buy happiness or secure love. It would be to rebuild the kind of kindness that boy had shown me. Because if someone with nothing could still choose compassion, then what excuse did I have? When I stepped out of that hotel room, the air felt different, almost lighter, as if the world itself was waiting to see what I would do next. I walked slowly through the hallway, holding my small bag close to me, thinking about how strange it was that a person could feel more alive after losing everything than they ever did while having it all. Outside, the sky was a soft gray, the kind that makes you feel quiet on the inside, and I stood there for a moment just breathing it in. I didn't have a clear map of what I was going to do, but for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of not knowing. I knew I had resources, I knew I had money tucked away in places no one could touch, but I didn't feel the need to run toward comfort anymore. I felt drawn to something deeper, something that came from that simple bowl of soup shared between strangers. I found a small diner a few blocks away and took a seat near the window. As I watched people pass by, I began to think about the difference between surviving and living. My family had grown so comfortable that they forgot what it meant to appreciate anything. They only valued what made them look good, what made them feel important, But they never valued the quiet moments, the human moments, the acts of kindness that didn't come with applause. That boy, with barely enough food to keep himself warm, had given me more than a meal. He had given me perspective, and with that perspective came a responsibility I hadn't felt before. As I stirred the tea the waitress placed in front of me, an idea started growing inside me. Soft at first, but steady. Like a seed finally catching the right amount of light. I realized that my next step wasn't about revenge, and it wasn't about proving anything to the people who turned their backs on me. It was about building something meaningful out of the pain I had walked through. I wasn't meant to return home with anger in my chest. I was meant to use what I had left to lift someone else out of the cold, the way that child unknowingly lifted me. I finished my tea, left a generous tip, and walked out with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Every step seemed clearer, every thought calmer. I wasn't going back to beg for love that should have never needed proving. I was moving forward to create the kind of love that didn't fail when circumstances changed. I whispered to myself that if the world could show me kindness in its harshest corners, then maybe I could give back in a way that would matter to someone who needed it just as much as I once did. When I stepped back out onto the sidewalk after leaving the diner, I felt a kind of quiet determination settling over me. The kind that doesn't shout or announce itself, but moves through your body like a slow, steady heartbeat. I walked without rushing, letting my thoughts guide my steps, and the more I reflected on everything that had happened, the more certain I became that my life needed a new direction, one that didn't revolve around proving myself to people who had already made up their minds about my worth. I thought about all the years I had spent pouring energy into relationships that took more than they ever returned, and how quickly those same people let go of me the moment I said I had nothing left. It struck me how fragile their loyalty had been, how easily it crumbled when money and comfort were no longer part of the picture. And yet, in that cold moment under the overpass, a complete stranger with nothing to his name chose to share warmth with me simply because he saw a person in need. As I continued walking, I found myself near a small park bench, and I sat down for a moment to breathe, feeling the cool air move softly across my face. I remembered how the boy's eyes had held a kind of strength that wasn't shaped by privilege or expectation, but by survival and compassion. That memory stayed with me, replaying over and over. And the more I thought about it, the more I knew I couldn't let that moment pass without turning it into something larger. I had seen firsthand what real hardship looked like. Not the kind that bruises pride, but the kind that bruises the soul. And I couldn't return to my old life pretending I hadn't witnessed it. My wealth, which once felt like security, now felt like an opportunity, something that had been waiting silently for me to realize what it was truly meant for. I stood up again and made my way toward the local community center, a place I had driven past countless times without ever stepping inside. When I walked through the doors, I saw a few volunteers sorting through boxes of donated clothes and canned food, their faces tired but determined. For a moment, I simply watched, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and gratitude. I approached the front desk and asked if they needed help, and the woman behind the counter looked at me with surprise, then smiled warmly and nodded. She didn't ask why I was there or what had brought me in. She just said they could always use another pair of hands. As I helped organize blankets and pack small care kits, I felt something inside me shift, something gentle but powerful, like a light finally finding its way into a dark corner. I wasn't thinking about my husband or my children anymore. I wasn't thinking about who failed me or who turned their back when I needed them. I was thinking about what I could do now. What kind of difference I could make with the time and resources I still had. For the first time in a long while, I felt the kind of peace that doesn't come from having everything, but from knowing you're giving something meaningful. By the time I walked out of the center, the sky had begun to darken, and the streetlights flickered on again. But unlike the night I spent underneath them, I didn't feel lost or forgotten. I felt guided. I felt purposeful. I told myself that this was only the beginning, that I would grow this feeling into something real, something lasting, something that could help people who had been overlooked the same way I had been. And as I walked away, I knew deep down that I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was rebuilding my heart, piece by piece, with compassion leading every step. As I left the community center that evening, I walked slowly, letting the cool air touch my face while my thoughts settled into a calm I hadn't felt in years. A calm that came not from certainty, but from finally listening to the quiet voice inside me that had been silenced for too long. I knew then that helping for an hour wasn't enough, not for what I wanted to build, not for what my heart had awakened to. So the next morning, with a clear mind and a sense of purpose that felt almost like a new kind of strength, I met with my lawyer in a small office far from town, choosing a place where no one who claimed to know me would think to look. I sat across from him and explained in steady words that I wanted to create something lasting, something that would give shelter and food and dignity to people who didn't have a place to fall when life pushed them down. He stared at me for a moment, surprised, but when he saw I wasn't speaking out of impulse or emotion alone, he began drawing up the documents I needed. I moved assets quietly, protecting everything from the people who had turned their backs on me, and for the first time, I felt empowered, not because of the money, but because I finally knew what I wanted to do with it. When I left his office, I walked out into the sunlight with a sense of direction I hadn't had in decades. I wasn't the woman who left her home with a single bag anymore. I was someone rebuilding her world with intention. Someone who understood that real change begins with a single act of kindness and grows from the courage to keep going. And as I took those steps toward the life I was creating, I whispered to myself that everything I was doing now would honor the moment. A small bowl of warm soup reminded me what humanity truly meant. When the paperwork was finally in motion and every decision had been made with clarity instead of fear, I realized it was time to return home, not to stay, not to beg for a place in the life I had been pushed out of, but to face the people who believed losing money meant losing worth. I took a slow breath as I stepped onto my street, letting the memories rise and fall without letting them drown me. The house stood exactly as I left it. The paint still neat, the curtains still drawn, the yard still trimmed, as if nothing had changed. Yet everything inside me had shifted so deeply that even the walls looked unfamiliar. I walked up to the door and knocked, hearing the faint footsteps approach. And when my husband opened it, the look on his face told me he never expected to see me standing there again. There was no warmth in his eyes, only confusion and discomfort, the kind people wear when the truth arrives before they're ready to face it. He asked where I had been, why I looked different, why I came without calling first, all questions that never touched the heart of what he had done. I listened quietly, then told him in the same calm tone I had used with my lawyer that I hadn't come to argue or to explain my absence. I came because I needed to hear, with my own ears, whether he had changed his mind or if he still believed that my value was tied to the things I owned instead of the life I had shared with him. His silence answered the question long before his words did, because silence has a way of revealing what people try so hard to hide. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and tired, asking if I was ready to come back home and try again, but I heard the truth beneath it. He wasn't asking because he missed me. He was asking because he wanted the security he thought he had lost. I took a slow breath and told him gently that I wasn't the woman who walked out with a bag in her hand and a heart full of doubt. I was someone who had seen what real compassion looked like, not in rich homes or polished conversations, but in the quiet kindness of someone who had nothing. I told him that I had found a part of myself I didn't know I had lost, and I wasn't going to let that part shrink again, just to fit inside a life where love was conditional. I watched his expression shift from confusion to regret, but regret without change is only another kind of comfort, and I wasn't there to soothe him. I stepped back from the doorway, telling him I wished him peace, truly, but I would no longer be tied to a life that had forgotten how to value humanity. As I walked away, I felt no bitterness. Instead, there was a quiet sense of closure wrapping itself around me. The kind that comes when you finally understand that some doors close not to punish you, but to guide you somewhere you were meant to be all along. And with every step I took, I felt the certainty grow stronger. A certainty that this new path I had chosen held more truth, more purpose, and more love than the life I had left behind. I walked away from that house with a calm I never imagined I could feel. A calm that came from choosing myself for the first time in decades. And as I made my way down the familiar road, I felt the weight I had carried for years begin to slip off my shoulders piece by piece. When I reached the end of the street, I stopped for a moment and looked back. Not out of longing, but out of gratitude. Because even though that place had broken me, it had also pushed me toward the person I was becoming. I continued walking until the houses grew sparse and the noise faded. And when I reached the main road, I felt something inside me settle, as if the chapter had finally closed. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hurting the same way. I was simply free. Over the next few days, I poured myself into the foundation I was building, working closely with the community center, local shelters, and volunteers who understood the value of compassion without conditions. I met women who had survived storms far worse than mine, children who carried hope in places where it barely fit, and men who had lost everything yet still found ways to smile at strangers. Each story reminded me that humanity doesn't disappear when life becomes hard. It reveals itself. And as I listened to every voice, every struggle, every triumph, I realized that what I was creating wasn't just an organization. It was a lifeline, one built from the very pain I thought would destroy me. Every evening, when I finally sat alone, I thought about the boy who shared that small bowl of soup with me, and how his simple act began this entire transformation. I wished I could tell him that the warmth he offered that night didn't end with me. It had spread into something much bigger, something that would touch lives he would never meet. And even though I didn't know where he was, or if I would ever see him again, I carried him in every decision I made, because sometimes a single moment of kindness becomes the beginning of a story you didn't know you were meant to live. One quiet afternoon, while I was helping sort supplies at the shelter, I felt a gentle tug at my sleeve, and when I turned, there he was, the same boy who had sat beside me under the overpass, holding that tiny bowl of warm soup like it was treasure. He looked a little taller, a little stronger, but his eyes were the same, steady and kind. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there in a stillness that felt almost sacred, as if life had brought us full circle without needing to explain a single thing. When I finally knelt down to his height, he gave me the same small smile he had given me that night and said he heard someone had been helping the shelter, someone who reminded him of the woman he had shared his dinner with. Hearing that made my eyes well with tears, not from sadness, but from the quiet realization that kindness always finds its way back, even if it takes time. I told him softly that his small act had changed my life, that it opened a door inside me I didn't know had grown shut. He listened with that gentle patience of his, and when I finished, he simply nodded and slipped his hand into mine, not asking for anything, not expecting anything in return. In that moment, I understood something I had never truly grasped before. Family isn't defined by blood or names or the history written on paper. It's shaped by the hands that reach for you when the world turns its back, by the souls who see you even when you think you've become invisible, and by the hearts that choose you without needing a reason. As we walked together through the shelter, I felt an overwhelming gratitude for the journey I had taken, painful as it was. Losing everything I pretended to lose had led me to everything I didn't know I needed. I found truth, purpose, and a connection that no amount of money could buy. And now, standing here with that boy, I knew my life had shifted into something meaningful, something honest, something rooted in the kindness I once received in my darkest moment. Thank you for staying with me till the end of my story. It truly means so much to me. If this touched your heart in any way, please take a moment to subscribe and share your thoughts below. I'd love to know how this story made you feel.